Yesterday we discussed the principle called Bimashki Yisrael Ben Amutal Beficha, and you're only allowed to bring on the Mizbeach that which is Mutal Le'achilas Adam, and therefore if you brought a mincha and it was Tevel or some other Isur, it would be a mincha psula, would be disqualified. Now, if you have page Yud Ches, what we're up to is the left column. And in case you don't have it, then at least for now, you'll open up to, it's the first, you see the ribbons on the bottom? It's the first of the two ribbons. So look for page Yud Ches. Now on the left column, you'll see a paragraph that starts Hafzoras Komet Shenikmatz Bipsul L'Kliya Mincha. And the topic of discussion is what I call reversibility as opposed to irreversible. And what I mean is that in certain situations of psul, they're salvageable. In other situations, it's already etched in stone. There's a psul aguf, a cheftz of psul, and you cannot salvage it. It's already gone. So here's the case. Let's say someone who is possible did the kmitza of the mincha. So say, for example, the Kohen was a Balmud, or he was Tomei. Now I'll have another example. Let's say that the Kohen who did the kmitza did it with his left hand instead of his right hand. And in Kodshim, all avoda has to be implemented with the right hand. Oh, be yeshiva. There's no such thing as yeshiva in the azara for the avoda. The avoda has to be implemented be'amid. So in all the cases that we mentioned, the kmitza is disqualified. However, the issue now is, does that mean that the mincha is gone, just throw it into the rubbish? Or is it salvageable? Can I replace the kmitza and fix up all the holes and do a kmitza kshera? And here we have a machlokas tanoim. The Chachamim say it's irreversible. There's no way you can salvage this carbon because the kmitza was already done. The kmitza was implemented in psul, and the mincha is therefore a mincha psul. That's a chal Shem. That is a change in status in the gufo shel mincha, and it cannot be fixed. That's the sheet of the Chacham. We'll soon see the dissenting view of Ben Beseir. But before we do that, as a matter of analyzing the Chachamim sheet, we have a piece from the Gris, which is from the Brisker Rav, in footnote number Shin Yudal. Histapek b'tam adov ha'imu mishum shegam kmitza psula nechsheves lekmitza shal yoda nikva kol hakemach hanisha b'kli l'shirayim yeshuvi efshal asos mimenu komets. He has a brilliant insight as to the Shitas Chachamim, why this is a situation that cannot be reversed. And you don't necessarily have to say that, as we said, that the avodah b'psul generates a chalos carbon possum. Forget about that. There's another reason for it. And that is because of the unique relationship in a mincha when there's kmitza and the shirayim. And what it means is that once the kmitza was done b'psul, then it cannot be kovea. It cannot have the proper impact on the shirayim, on the balance of the mincha. Right? You have a kli sharis, and the kli is filled with soles. He does a kmitza on part of the soles, and that kmitza is meant to be kovea, the balance of the kemach, of the soles that's in the kli, as a karba mincha, such that now the mincha can be considered a mincha, not because of the komets. The komets was done b'psul, But why not consider the mincha as viable, as a mincha kshera, because of the shirayim? If, let's say, the avoda of the kmitza was done b'psul, that has no impact on the shirayim, so the shirayim should be a valid korban mincha, and will be makter the shirayim. I'm sorry, will eat the shirayim. The kohanim will eat the shirayim, even though there won't be a haktorah of the kmitza. Says the Brisker Rav, there's no such thing. The status of the shirayim as a korban, as a mincha, is totally, completely dependent upon the kmitza. If the kmitza is invalid, then it cannot be kovea the shirayim. There's a process in which A triggers off B. A is the kmitza, and B is the status of the shirayim. If the kmitza is psula, and you want to now say, well, wait a minute, I can salvage this mincha because of the shirayim, right? There was no avodah psula done, implemented in the shirayim. No, you can't do that, because the status of the shirayim is totally dependent upon and engendered by the kmitza. If the kmitza is psul, that psul now makes it impossible for the kmitza itself to have any impact, to be kovea the shirayim as a korban mincha. And if you don't have a mechanism by which, an agent by which you kovea the shirayim as a korban mincha, then the entire mincha, the whole enterprise, is meaningless. And therefore, the Brisker Rav suggests that according to Chachamim, when they say shubein lo takana, they don't mean what you think they mean, that the psul is now chal in the gufa shel korban, because that itself is not convincing. When I talk about the gufa shel korban, I can separate between two independent segments of the korban mincha, namely the kometz, which is certainly possible, and the shirayim. There was no avoda, the psul that was implemented on the shirayim. Hence, if I separate the two, the shirayim itself doesn't have a chal l'shem psul. Says the Brisker Rav, that's not the problem with Chachamim. When the Chachamim say ein la takana, they don't mean because there's a psul that's chal in the shirayim, but because the shirayim themselves cannot be called shirayim, meaning they don't have the upgraded status of a korban mincha. And that's because there's no status of a korban mincha in the shirayim, even though it's in the same kli, unless there's a kmitza. The kmitza is what generates and impacts on the shirayim, uplifting the shirayim and upgrading it to the status of a korban mincha. But if the kmitza is psula, it cannot have that impact. It cannot effectuate a shirayim as a korban. Okay, ad kan shitas chacham. Now we get to the more challenging and radical shita of Ben Beseir. Yesh lo takan. All you have to do is take the kometz, put it back into the kli, and start from scratch. Do and implement a second kmitza to replace the first kmitza. Now, if not for the Brisker Rav, I would have said that perhaps what the Ben Beseir Shita in its underlying principle is that the kmitza, even b'psul, does not effectuate a chalos in the same korban, meaning in the gufo shel korban, the chefetz shel korban has not been changed. A kmitza psula means a zero kmitza. It's the absence of a kmitza. It doesn't have a positive impact in a negative sense, if you follow what I mean. It's not a kmitza that the halacha recognizes that can generate a psul in the korban. It's just zero. It doesn't register at all. So forget about this kmitza. Get yourself a better kohen who's not a balmum, and he will stand for the kmitza, and he will do it with his right hand and not with his left hand, and he'll do the kmitza again. However, that's not going to be enough to explain Ben Beseir. Why? Because now we have the Brisker Rav, and the Brisker Rav is saying that according to Chachamim Shita, you cannot separate between the kmitza and the shirayim, and the status of the mincha is now totally dependent upon the kmitza. If you don't have a kmitza kshera, then the korban is possible. Not because the korban is possible to gufa, but because there's nothing to impact and upgrade the status of the Shirayim as a Korban Mincha because I need the Kmitza for that. So the Brisker Rav says, no. If Ben Beseir is correct, and there's no such thing as a Kmitza Psula, then the status of the Shirayim is sort of hovering up in the air. It's undefined. I just simply need to plug in a Kmitza that will be Kovei the Shirayim as the Korban Mincha. If I didn't do it on the first round, says Ben Beseira, and my original Kmitza could not effectuate as an Avodah Kshera the status of the Shirayim as a Mincha, then no great loss. Go back to square one, start from the get-go, and implement a new Kmitza and get it right this time. However, the Mishnah tells us that Ben Beseira was not convinced, based on logic, that you could simply replace a Kmitza Psula as if nothing happened and start from scratch. Take the komets, put it back into the Kli, and do a new Kmitza. Ben Beseira himself had to convince himself. And in order to do so, Svara was not alone, was not sufficient. He needed a pasuk. Shenema, and this is at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, with regard to Mincha, it says, V'komatz misham. Now that seems pretty innocuous. What's the big deal here? V'komatz misham. Do the Kmitza from the Kli, misham. However, says Ben Beseira, mashma, that v'komatz misham, that the word misham means from the place where there already was a Kmitza. Mimakav chekvar komatz pam achas is yachzir v'yikmotz pam shniya. Meaning the word misham is redundant. It sort of emphasizes or isolates a certain location. We'll call it X. Why do you have to add that? Just say v'komatz. Do the Kmitza. What do you mean misham? From there. And the answer is that from there means from that Kli where there already was a Kmitza. And the Torah is now telling you that you could do a Kmitza al gabi Kmitza. And one Kmitza can be replaced by the other. The second Kmitza will replace the first. In event that the first Kmitza was not a kosher Kmitza that could be effective. Fine. So we now have the sheet of Ben Beseira. The Gemara is going to take over now and further analyze the Shita of Ben Beseira. So it's very fascinating. This is a rare kind of structure in the Talmud where a Tana in the Mishnah is quoted, and then the Gemara quotes a Brisa which records a machlokas, how to interpret that one Tana. And that's what we have here. We have now a Brisa, and the Brisa records the Shitos of the Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi, and both are arguing about the Shita Ben Beseira. The Tanakama says that Afil Yachar Shekfar Kiddush Sakovet V'Kli Hichshir Ben Beseira LaHachzir LeMincha ULashuv V'Likmot. Okay, we'll put that on the back burners. We'll get to the Tanakama, but first, let's spend a little time on Rabbi Yossi. L'das Rabbi Yossi, and also Rabbi Yehuda. Hichshir Ben Beseira LaHachzir Rak li'achar Kmitza bilvad. There was Kmitza, but there was no Kiddush HaKometz B'Kli. You may recall that we discussed that there are two occasions in which the soles is placed into a Kli Sharetz. In fact, in all likelihood, it's two different kelim. There's the original Kli where you were Makadesh, the soles, the entire mixture of the soles before the Kmitza, and that Kiddush Kli is only stage one. After the Kmitza, We have stage 2. We take the kmitza, the kometz, and we place it into another kli, or perhaps a second time in the same kli. And that clinches the kmitza, the kiddush, the kiddush of the kmitza, such that now we're ready to take the kometz and be makter on the mizbeh. According to Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, under what circumstances did Ben Beseira allow you to take the kometz that was a result of a kmitza psula, put it back into the kli, and re-implement, if you will, the kmitza? That's only when you didn't get to the stage of the second kiddush kli. You're in between. You've passed stage 1, but you're not yet past stage 2. Stage 1 is the kiddush kli before the kmitza. Stage 2 is the kiddush kli after the kmitza. And the kiddush process was not complete. Therefore, Ben Beseira holds that that kmitza does not register. If it was done with psul, and there was only stage 1, first stage kiddush b'kli, then nothing happened. We say in Yiddish, garnish geshat. Nothing terrible happened. The shidduch is still on. He can simply replace the kmitza. However, says Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, then Beseira would agree that if not only was the kmitza b'psul, but he took the kometz and he placed it into the second kli, which means he now completed and clinched the process of kiddush. In such a case, the kometz and the kmitza registers. And once it registered, it cannot be revoked and it cannot be replaced. The Tanakama, on the other hand, says no. Then Beseira went even as far as replacing a kmitza that was after the second kiddush kli. He already had placed the soles in the kli. He had already implemented the kmitza. And not only that, he took the kometz and he placed it into kli charts. The second kiddush, which completes the kiddush. Doesn't matter. Says the Tanakama within the framework of Ben Beseira that a kmitza psula, and we gave a number of examples, doesn't register. It's kiman de lesedo. It is not a kmitza poseles. It's not a kmitza at all. Start from scratch and replace the kmitza. According to Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, Hichshir Ben Beseira lachziko dafka li'achar kmitza bilvad. Kolzman shalom nitar hakometz b'kli. Right, the second round where you've already done the kmitza, now you put the kometz b'kli. Is adayin lo nigmara avodas hakmitza. According to the second opinion in Ben Beseira, the avodah of kmitza is not yet registered. The clincher will be when you place the kmitza into kli sharetz. Im kvar kiddush hakometz al yedei nesinas b'kli sharetz. Modeh Ben Beseira, according to the shita, Eshuv I efshar lachziro lemincha. And the reason for that is shekein me'achar shenigmar avoda. The kmitza is a kmitza psula, and it engenders or generates a psul on the entire mincha. In the light of these two shitos, the Tanakama versus Rabbi Yossi in Ben Beseira, we could suggest that the issue is, what's the status of a kmitza psul? How does Ben Beseira define a kmitza psul? One way is to say that a kmitza psula is an incomplete avodah, and that's why Ben Beseira is willing to replace it, because it doesn't yet have that status of an avodah. The other way of explaining Ben Beseira is that it doesn't have the status of avodah because it was done with psul. That's not avodah. You can't have an avodah that was done with psul. Again, assuming the psul is likuva, it's absolutely critical. And then afkamina is going to be the case where he did the kmitza and then he had a second nesina b'kli. According to one opinion, in Rabbi Yossi, Ben Beseira would admit in this case that it's too late. Why? Because the Kohen completed the entire avodah. When does Ben Beseira allow a replacement kmitza? That's only if the kmitza did not register as a full-fledged avodah. He hasn't completed the avodah of kmitza. To complete the avodah of kmitza, he has to take the kovetz and place it into klisheni, klisharetz. He hasn't done so yet. So the avodah is not complete. Tanakama's understanding of Ben Beseira is much more far-reaching. I agree with you that even after in event that he put it into the second kli, the avodah is complete. The Kohen can go home and go back to his family, and he's on vacation. He can clock out, punch out. The day is ended. The avodah is complete. But that's not Ben Beseira. Ben Beseira is not trying to freeze the process of the avodah midway before it completes itself, and that's when he replaces the kometz. No, Ben Beseira is telling us that the avodah b'psul is not called an avodah. So that even if the Kohen has already placed the kometz in the second kli, and ostensibly the avodah has now been complete, no. Says Ben Beseira, that's not an avodah at all. We go on now to another topic called shutfus. Now it's interesting. When you talk about a mincha, in most cases, you're talking about a neder or a nedava, and that means that Ploni Almoni pledged to bring a korban mincha out of the goodness of his heart. And that's what a neder is all about. A neder means that I have a personal commitment to go beyond my obligation and on a voluntary basis to bring a gift to the Almighty. But I'm a loner. I stand on my own 2 feet, independent of anyone else. And I added an extra mitzvah to the 613 for me, or maybe we should include it under neder. What happens in the following scenario? It's a very strange kind of scenario. 2 people, Reuven and Shimon, get together, form a union, a cartel, and they decide, as a partnership, they want to bring a voluntary korban mincha. Shnayim yecholim ladur o lindov korban lemizbeach. What does that mean? 2 people can take a neder or a nedava to bring a korban lemizbeach. That's for sure true. All of Masechta Zvachim, all of Kodshim is about shutfus. In fact, one of the most lumdisha issues in Kodshim is the difference between korban hashutfim and korban hatzibur. But there definitely is a recognized bona fide entity called korban hashutfim. That's only in Zebah, but not in Mincha. Mincha eina ba b'shutfus. 2 people cannot get together and pledge a voluntary korban mincha. There's no such thing. And this is not logical. Because in the world of Kodshim, so much of what we study in Kodshim revolves around shutfim. Now you're telling me that in Menachos, I finished Masechta Zvachim, I'm on to Masechta Menachos. I don't remember which comes first. And now you're telling me that forget about shutfim, Masechta Menachos, recognizes no possibility of shutfus. Why? And the answer is a gzeras hakos. Shekei nemar bo, when the Torah speaks about mincha, nefesh kisaku. A mincha has to come from the nefesh. It's a total voluntary enterprise. And we're going to darshan nefesh v'lo shutf. One nefesh can be motivated and bring a carbon nidava of a mincha. Two, a partnership just won't, it won't go, it won't cut the mustard. There's no such thing as a double yachid, meaning a shutfus in nidre mincha. And that has to be derived from a pasuk. Nefesh ki yaakov. I suspect just the image of my Rebbe is hovering over my head, and I'm afraid to say what I want to say. That the word nefesh in this context reveals something about the nature of a carbon mincha that classifies mincha in its own category in the world of Kodshim, and that is nefesh. The mincha itself is the nefesh of the person. There's no room for partnership in a nefesh. You have your nefesh, I have my nefesh. The mincha has to be a mincha of a nefesh. The mincha itself has a nefesh, so to speak, in it. And there's no such thing as sharing a mincha with two nefashos. A zevach has to come yikem, as the Torah says at the beginning of Vayikra, but not as a carbon of the nefesh. You can have two bailim bringing one single zevach. In that sense, zvachim becomes a lot closer to dinei mamonos. Mincha is totally, again, I hate to use the word because, as I said, the image of my Rebbe is in the back of my mind and he's laughing at me. But nefesh tells me something about the essence of the carbon mincha. There's a relationship between the person who took this pledge and is bringing the mincha and the mincha itself. It's almost as if the mincha is an extension of the identity of the noder. It's his mincha. Because it's a nefesh. And the nefesh of the noder is, what word can I use, is cloned, is transmitted, and what's the word I'm looking for? The seal, you know what I'm talking about? When you penetrate a certain identity into the mincha itself. Bonanza, you remember that? I don't know what word to use when you push down the seal on an object. The nefesh of the noder is implanted, is engraved in the mincha itself. And a mincha of a nefesh cannot be shared with two people. We can't, again, in monetary law, we can go into a car dealer and buy a car b'shutfis. You and I. You'll drive in it Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday, and I'll drive in it Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, whatever the days are. We'll divide it up. We can buy an animal, and we both own the animal. We could buy a piece of real estate, and this partnership. And even in Zvachim, like Didi Moment, it's like monetary law, is a technical, mechanical ownership over the Zevach. And the zevach has to be brought. Who are the bailim? It could be a carbon yachid, it could be a carbon shutfin, it could be a carbon tzibur, any of the above, all these kinds of different scenarios. But a mincha, that's the gift of a nefesh. And that's why I believe you'll find very often in the Torah that for an ani, a poor person, his option is going to be to bring a mincha. Because in a sense, when you're dealing with a nefesh, all the externalities about how much money you're worth in the bank are kimanda lesson. They're void and they're irrelevant. So the ani, in that sense, represents nefesh. The mincha is specifically related to the ani, not just because it's cheap, it's inexpensive relative to a zebach by many-fold times, but because of the element of nefesh. The nefesh of an ani is a pure nefesh that's stripped of any sort of externalities, any sort of monetary status. He can barely eke out enough money to buy a mincha, but the mincha is from his nefesh. And the ani has the same, if not a more profound nefesh than anyone else. So again, my Rebbe might be cringing up in Shemaim, I don't know. But it's a thought, and I think it's something that maybe we could research further as we go through more material on Menachos. Okay. Minchas Nisachim, Hakreva im Azemach, Ba B'Shutfis. In other words, every carbon mincha is an independent entity, and it's an entity of nefesh, which precludes shutfis. But there's one category of a carbon mincha that's not an independent entity. It's a nachschlepper. It is an addendum or an auxiliary accompaniment. And that's minchas nisachim, where the Torah commands us to bring a zevach, a carbon tamid, whatever it might be, and accompany the carbon tamid with its mincha. And in that case, shutfis doesn't bother. Shnayim she'iviu carbon adov b'shutfis, meviim imo minchas nisachim abba ima zera. Yesh me'achronim she'stapik v'minchas nisachim sheba ben adova below zevach ha'im hi ba b'shutfis olo. Can I create an entity of a minchas nisachim without a zevach? Right? Like, for example, we find a nidvas eitzin or a nidvas yayin. So I can take an adova to bring logs of wood and burn them on the maracha, or to pour yayin. It doesn't have any structure. It really is not a carbon in any sense, but yet the Torah gave me the ability to bring such a carbon on a voluntary basis. Can I now take an entity called minchas nisachim and create it as an entity unto itself without a zevach? Right? Is Nedava like Chomer B'yad HaYotzeh, where the Torah gives us, like raw material, various kinds of hakrovos on the Mizbeach, and I can create my own, how should I say, my own shnit. I could groove it out the way I want to groove it, and I'm going to create a minchas nisachim, which does not comply in any sense or form to the minchas nisachim in the ideal sense, as the Torah designed it. It's not accompanying any zevach. And if I could do so, then the Achronim want to know, perhaps I could go a step further, and I could create a nedava which takes on the identity of a minchas nisachim. It's a pella, because it's not a minchas nisachim with a zevach, but I took a neder to bring a minchas nisachim. I'm going to bring it with all the rules that govern the Torah and its ideal paradigmic minchas nesach, which means even v'shutfus. Now, Rabosai, we're going to talk about the mitzvah of achilas mincha. So that will leave the mitzvah Hashem for tomorrow. And some of the issues we'll talk about is a bracha on achilas mincha and other such issues.